There are television shows that come along once in a generation, programs so perfectly constructed, so deeply emotional, and so completely woven into the cultural fabric of their era that audiences simply cannot imagine life without them. These are the rare productions that transcend the boundaries of entertainment and become something closer to shared national experience. Programs that families gather around not merely for distraction, but for genuine connection, genuine laughter, and genuine feeling. MASH was exactly and completely that kind of show. For 11 remarkable seasons, it captured the hearts and imaginations of millions of viewers across America and around the entire world, blending sharp and intelligent comedy with raw and unflinching human drama in a way that no program before it had ever managed quite so effectively or quite so memorably. It was a show that made you laugh until your sides ached and then, sometimes in the very next moment, made you feel the weight of something genuinely tragic pressing down on your chest. Set against the backdrop of the Korean War, MASH told the story of surgeons, nurses, clerks, and commanding officers stationed at a mobile army surgical hospital far from home. Men and women doing impossible and exhausting work under impossible and exhausting conditions, finding laughter and human connection and moments of real beauty in the middle of unimaginable suffering and moral confusion. The show was smart, frequently hilarious, often heartbreaking, and consistently profound, operating simultaneously on multiple emotional frequencies in a way that distinguished it from virtually everything else on American television during its long and celebrated run. Audiences did not simply watch MASH. They lived inside it, season after season, caring about the characters with an intensity that was genuinely unusual for a medium that often struggled to inspire real emotional investment. But behind the cameras, and beyond the carefully crafted episodes that made MASH a cultural monument, a different and considerably more complicated story was unfolding in the real world. Some of the most important, most beloved, and most talented actors on the show, the performers whose faces audiences had memorized, whose characters had become like familiar friends, whose work had helped transform MASH from a promising premise into the phenomenon it ultimately became, made the decision to walk away. Not because the show was in decline, not because their contributions were going unrecognized or unappreciated, but for reasons that were deeply and specifically personal, professionally nuanced, and in some cases genuinely painful. Their departures reshaped the series in ways that were both immediate and lasting, and understanding why they chose to leave tells you something essential not just about the individuals involved, but about the nature of fame itself, the demands of artistic integrity, the weight of long-term professional commitment, and the fundamentally human need to be seen and valued as something more than a single fixed identity. To truly appreciate the significance of these departures, you have to first appreciate what MASH actually was and what it meant to the American public that embraced it so completely. The show premiered in the early 1970s and immediately and powerfully connected with an audience that was still living through the ongoing trauma and deep moral confusion of the Vietnam War. Even though the series was technically set in Korea, with the historical distance of a different conflict providing a layer of separation from the immediate political moment, nobody watching it had any serious doubts about what it was genuinely saying or who it was genuinely speaking to and about. The absurdity of assembling brilliant and compassionate healers in a combat zone, of asking people whose entire professional purpose was the preservation of human life to function effectively within an institution whose fundamental purpose was the destruction of it, struck a deep and lasting nerve with viewers in a way that straightforward war narratives never quite managed to replicate. The genius of MASH was that it wrapped its most serious and challenging observations in the protective covering of humor, using comedy as a kind of emotional anesthetic that made the underlying pain bearable and the underlying truth more accessible. The jokes were real and often genuinely funny. The camaraderie between characters felt authentic and earned, but underneath all of that warmth and laughter ran a current of real grief and real moral questioning that gave the show a weight and a seriousness that distinguished it from anything else in its time slot or its genre. That combination, entertainment and substance braided together so skillfully that you could not easily separate them, turned MASH into one of the most consistently highly rated programs in the entire history of American television, producing a series finale that remains to this very day one of the most watched broadcasts ever transmitted into American living rooms. The ensemble cast that brought this extraordinary show to life was from the very beginning extraordinarily rich with talent, charisma, and genuine human depth. At the absolute center of everything stood Hawkeye Pierce, the brilliant, irreverent, deeply principled surgeon played by Alda, with a combination of wit and moral passion that made the character almost impossible to look away from. Hawkeye was the conscience of the show, the character through whose eyes the audience processed the contradictions and costs of war, and Alda's performance was so complete and so consistently excellent that it inevitably shaped the gravitational field around which every other character had to find its orbit. Around him, a rotating and evolving cast of remarkable performers brought the world of the 4077th Mobile Army Surgical Hospital to vivid and fully realized life, each of them contributing something specific and essential to the show's overall identity and emotional texture. And when several of them chose, for reasons of their own, to step away from that world, the reverberations were immediate, profound, and in some cases permanent. McLean Stevenson was among the first to make that decision, and the manner in which his departure was handled by the show's writers and producers transformed what might have been a straightforward cast transition into one of the most dramatically powerful and emotionally resonant moments in the history of the medium. Stevenson played Lieutenant Colonel Henry Blake, the commanding officer of the 4077th, a man whose authority was perpetually undermined by his own fundamental decency and his complete inability to maintain the psychological distance that military command theoretically requires. Henry Blake was warm, bumbling, occasionally foolish, and entirely lovable, a commanding officer who was commanded far more often than he commanded, who found it essentially impossible to say no to the people under his care, and who somehow made that weakness feel like a form of genuine human strength. Stevenson brought enormous charm and genuine comedic skill to the role, and audiences responded to Henry Blake with a depth of affection that made him one of the most popular characters on the show. He received a Golden Globe for the performance, and the security and prominence of his position on one of television's biggest hits seemed, from the outside, completely unassailable. But Stevenson himself did not see his situation that way, and his internal experience of his own career was fundamentally different from what his public profile suggested. Beneath the visible success and the genuine professional recognition, he was experiencing a growing and eventually consuming frustration with the way his character was being written and the role his character was being asked to play in the larger architecture of the show. He felt, with increasing conviction as the seasons progressed, that Henry Blake was being systematically underused, that the creative energy of the writers was flowing in directions that consistently prioritized other characters, while his own remained relatively static and underdeveloped. He saw the storylines being constructed around Hawkeye and other central figures, and felt the contrast with what was being constructed around Henry Blake as a kind of professional diminishment that he found increasingly difficult to accept. More than that, Stevenson harbored ambitions that extended well beyond what his role on MASH allowed him to pursue. He wanted to be a genuine star in his own right, a leading man whose name above the title was the primary draw for an audience, not a beloved ensemble member whose considerable talents were deployed in service of a larger collective achievement. He was convinced, with a particular confidence that can sometimes accompany genuine talent before it has been fully tested against the market, that audiences who loved him on MASH would follow him wherever he chose to go next. That conviction, combined with his mounting creative frustrations, drove him to a decision that would define the rest of his professional life. He told the producers he was leaving the show, and the show responded in a way that he almost certainly had not anticipated and could not have fully prepared himself for emotionally or professionally. The writers, faced with the creative challenge of removing such a central and beloved character from the show's ongoing fabric, made a choice that was in retrospect genuinely groundbreaking, and that demonstrated the show's absolute willingness to pursue emotional truth, even when that truth was uncomfortable and upsetting. Henry Blake was honorably discharged from the Army, given the happy ending of a return to civilian life and his waiting family, and the audience was allowed to share in the warmth and relief of that apparent conclusion. And then, in the final moments of the episode, Radar walked into the operating room during surgery with a piece of paper in his hands and tears already forming in his eyes, and he read the news that Henry Blake's plane had been shot down over the Sea of Japan, and that there were no survivors. The reaction from cast members, who reportedly were not told about this ending in advance, and encountered it for the first time when they read the script, was one of genuine shock and genuine grief, and that authentic emotional response translated directly and powerfully onto the screen. It was a moment that stopped American television in its tracks, a moment that reminded audiences with brutal and unadorned directness that the show they were watching was not simply a comedy set in a hospital, that the war surrounding the characters they loved was real and lethal and indifferent to narrative satisfaction. Stevenson's exit from the show had accidentally produced one of the most important and memorable moments in television history, a moment that would define MASH's legacy as much as any other single episode or storyline. For Stevenson himself, however, the aftermath of that departure proved far more difficult and far more instructive than he had expected. The projects he pursued after leaving MASH failed, one after another, to generate anything approaching the audience connection he had enjoyed on the show. He discovered, slowly and painfully, a truth about the nature of television fame that many performers before and after him have had to confront, that the affection audiences feel for a performer is often inseparable from the specific character that performer inhabits, and that removing one from the other can reveal an uncomfortable gap between what a performer believes about their own appeal and what the audience actually experiences. He eventually acknowledged this reality himself, with a candor and self-awareness that was both admirable and genuinely sad. Wayne Rogers faced his own distinct and deeply felt set of frustrations during his time on MASH, frustrations that ultimately led him to make the same decision as Stevenson, but for reasons that were rooted more specifically in the creative dynamics of the show itself, rather than in external ambitions or personal restlessness. Rogers played Captain Trapper John McIntyre, the brilliant and irreverent thoracic surgeon who served as Hawkeye Pierce's closest friend, most trusted colleague, and most enthusiastic co-conspirator in the elaborate pranks and principled rebellions that defined the show's early comic identity. The partnership between Trapper John and Hawkeye was one of the primary pleasures of the show's first 3 seasons, a double act built on genuine chemistry, complementary comedic timing, and a shared moral framework that gave their antics a foundation of seriousness that prevented them from feeling merely frivolous. Rogers was a skilled and committed actor who brought real substance and real warmth to the role, and Trapper John, under his performance, was never simply a sidekick or a straight man, but a full and rounded human being whose friendship with Hawkeye felt genuine and irreplaceable. But as the seasons progressed and the show's creative priorities became increasingly clear, Rogers began to feel the weight of a professional reality that was difficult to ignore or rationalize away. He watched the writing consistently and systematically build up Hawkeye as the show's unambiguous emotional and narrative center, while Trapper John was gradually repositioned as a supporting figure whose primary function was to react to, enable, and amplify the experiences and choices of his more prominent friend. Rogers wanted more than that, not out of ego in any simple or uncharitable sense, but out of a genuine belief in the character's potential and a genuine desire to explore dimensions of Trapper John that the current creative direction was leaving unexplored. He sought conversations with producers about character development, about storylines that would give Trapper John his own emotional journey, rather than always filtering his experiences through his relationship with Hawkeye, about a creative partnership that would acknowledge his contribution to the show's success in more substantive ways. Those conversations did not produce the outcomes he needed, and ultimately Rogers made the decision that creative integrity and professional self-respect required him to leave. His exit from the show was handled in a manner that frustrated many devoted viewers. Trapper John simply disappeared between seasons, with Hawkeye arriving back at the 4077th after a leave to find that his closest friend had already been discharged and sent home, departing without the chance for a real goodbye, and without the kind of formal narrative send-off that the character's importance to the show seemed to demand. It felt abrupt and emotionally incomplete, a curtain falling in the middle of a sentence, and the audience's dissatisfaction with that handling reflected how much they had genuinely invested in the character Rogers had built. Larry Linville's departure from MASH after 5 seasons presents perhaps the most intellectually fascinating case study of all the major exits from the show, precisely because his motivations were so clearly and specifically grounded in a kind of artistic self-awareness and creative honesty that is genuinely rare in an industry that typically rewards the comfortable repetition of proven success. Linville played Major Frank Burns, the pompous, insecure, morally hypocritical, and frequently incompetent surgeon, whose rigid authoritarianism and transparent self-interest made him the perfect and inexhaustible target for Hawkeye's wit and moral outrage. Frank Burns was a villain of a very specific and human kind, not monstrous enough to be truly frightening, but flawed and petty and self-deluding in ways that made him simultaneously infuriating and, at unexpected moments, unexpectedly pitiable. Linville performed the character with tremendous precision and genuine comic craft, using every tool in his considerable technical arsenal to make Frank Burns consistently and specifically funny in ways that supported rather than undermined the show's more serious intentions. Audiences responded to the character with a passionate and reliable antipathy that was, paradoxically, one of the clearest possible measures of how effectively Linville was doing his job. You cannot love to hate someone you do not find genuinely believable, and Frank Burns was always genuinely and specifically believable as a type of human being that most people recognized from their own experience. The colleague who enforces rules he secretly breaks, the authority figure whose confidence is entirely disconnected from his actual competence, the person whose fear of being exposed as inadequate drives him to treat others with a cruelty he would never recognize in himself. Linville understood this character completely and played him with a disciplined and intelligent restraint that prevented Frank Burns from ever becoming a simple cartoon. But Linville was also, beneath the successful performance and the reliable audience response, a formally and rigorously trained actor with serious theatrical ambitions and a deep personal investment in the idea of artistic growth and creative challenge. He had studied his craft with genuine dedication and seriousness, and he brought to every performance a level of intentionality and craft that went far beyond what the character's surface comedy might have suggested to a casual observer. After 5 seasons of playing Frank Burns, he arrived at a clear and honest assessment of his own creative situation. He had taken the character as far as the character could go, had explored every significant dimension of that particular human type, and had reached the point where continuing to play him would mean doing something fundamentally incompatible with his understanding of what acting was supposed to be and do. It would mean standing completely still while pretending to move forward, maintaining the appearance of creative engagement while the actual substance of discovery and growth had long since been exhausted.